Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, your weekly libertarian podcast that is not brought to you by New York City's famed MTA, which has been putting the A in mass transit for more than a century. I am Matt Welch, joined remotely by a bearded Peter Suderman, and in the Chinatown studios live with me, Nick Gillespie, and returning guest star Liz Wolfe. High five, comrades.
Hey, Matt.
Hey.
Happy Monday.
So you decided
First,
your live persona or your in-studio persona is going to be like a pepper pot guy, like rat-a-tat?
No, just playing a little pepper here, Matt.
We haven't really talked here on this podcast yet, to my knowledge, although sometimes I do stroke out, about Clarence Thomas's controversial friendship with billionaire conservative donor Harlan Crow, a relationship that has produced several news cycles already, including a latest breathless account from CNN just this morning that the Supreme Court Justice's 94-year-old mother does not pay rent. Nick Gillespie, heaven forfend. She does pay property tax and insurance. Crow had bought her house.
I really don't even understand what that means, but...
Yep. We'll get to it. And we're going to you first. Crow had bought her house and 3 adjoining properties a decade ago with the stated intention of eventually opening a museum there about the Supreme Court's second ever black justice. Here's a quick timeline of the events thus far. On April 6th, the activist investigative nonprofit ProPublica, I did that, comes out with a piece showing that for 20 years, Clarence Thomas has enjoyed, without filing disclosures about his enjoyment, the generous hospitality in the form of fancy vacations and trips to Bohemian Grove, annual retreats in the Adirondacks from philanthropist Harlan Crow, if that is his real name, who for decades has been funding conservative groups like the American Enterprise Institute, the Federalist Society, and so forth. Halfway down the ProPublica story, after several quotes from outraged ethicists, we discover that the Supreme Court doesn't really have much of an ethics disclosure policy that would be relevant. The piece gets some attention, but then on April 7th, because we live in the smartest of all timelines, the Washingtonian magazine resurfaces a 2014 Dallas Morning News report about how Crow's extensive collection of totalitarian artifacts includes some Nazi stuff, like copies of Mein Kampf. Cue 1,000 headlines such as Clarence Thomas's billionaire buddy has a vast collection of Hitler paintings. Then ProPublica was back April 13th with a piece detailing Crow's purchase of the property where Thomas's mother lives, and now there are escalating Democratic calls for Chief Justice John Roberts to launch an ethics investigation, while Thomas himself has said he will refile some of his disclosure reports with additional Crow-related information. So, Nick, is this relationship potentially corrupting? Has Thomas been wrong to be a little bit slow in his reports, disclosure reports, and should this change the way we view?
I just want to preemptively say I'm glad you're hosting and Peter isn't, because he would have called this segment Eating Crow.
Oh,
right. Am I right?
I don't know. I can't listen to those. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess you're never here when he does it, so you don't have
exactly
to.
Right.
But
Nick, I'm glad that you stepped in to name the segment for me.
Yeah.
Because it just makes it much easier.
And I was looking back on our site to see if we had done anything with Harlan Crow. And the one thing that came up was a Vonnegut conspiracy entry from 2015 before it was housed at Reason.com, actually. But it was about a story that came out that was titled Marco Rubio's Hitler Problem. And it was about that Marco Rubio, little Marco, had gone to something with Harlan Crow. And Harlan, so this is one of those things where everybody, I guess, who gives a shit, really, but everybody knows that Harlan Crow has this remarkable repository of totalitarian or whatever you would call it.
Mao stuff.
And so there's so many things, to ask about here. And my first question was to you, Matt, when it said that Harlan Crow has a bunch of Hitler paintings. Are those paintings of Hitler or by Hitler?
Both, right?
I think yes.
Is it by both? Yeah, so it's
exactly.
like, pastoral landscapes by,
No,
Adolf.
exactly, yeah.
His failed art school, he was drawing Snappy the Turtle. And it was like, oh, that's why you didn't get into Vienna Art College, the Vienna Art Institute?
I mean, I'd buy it. If it wasn't that expensive, I'd buy it. Sure.
Yeah.
That's not from her,
and that, but I don't think that, Harlan Crow is a neo-Nazi or anything like that. I'm hearing about that garden. Like, I would be interested in going there.
I would say it was called the Garden of Evil, right? Or
something like that. Yeah.
And it had Mao stuff. It had Ceausescu stuff. Like, it wasn't just Hitler themed per se. I think some people's objection was that the indoor space where the paintings were, because paintings go indoors, I think those were Hitler oriented. But it's like kind of a damning indictment of all things communism and totalitarianism, right? Like,
and that is kind of odd. Let's move into, we're going to have butlered hors d'oeuvres in the Hitler room, and then let's eat in the Stalin dining room or something. I don't. But
I like to flip the order when I'm hosting. I prefer hors d'oeuvres in Stalin room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
obviously.
Yeah. And Mao obviously is for like after dinner, right?
Yeah. Digestives.
But I do think that there's an issue here, not an actual legal one or anything like that, but what this shows is how power operates. And I don't necessarily mean it's evil or dark or bad, but that you start to realize that billionaires and Crow released a statement saying, I have never talked to Justice Thomas about anything.
Yeah, I don't.
That we've never discussed any kind of legal case, especially one pending, or that might be blah blah blah. And it's like, I wonder what they talk about, because the last time I heard about Clarence Thomas traveling, it was in a Reason video about how the Chief Justices didn't want video in the courtroom, but then there's like pictures of Clarence Thomas, and he did a travel log for people. Like he and Ginny used to like to RV around the country, and they would park in Walmarts because Walmarts allow RVs to park there and plug into their electricity. And he's like going down the highway, hitting the horn on the RV and stuff like that. So I guess he got tired of that, and he wants to travel in style. Roundabout way of saying this, I don't think is an ethical lapse per se, but it kind of reveals to people, and this is more important, that, people who are powerful and influential pal around together, and they end up sharing a worldview. And it sometimes, it's insular on the left, sometimes it's on the right, et cetera. And I think it's good that we know all of this stuff. I don't think that it is ruinous of Clarence Thomas, who even people like left-wing scholars like Mark Tushnet, who is a critic of Thomas's jurisprudence, will say, this guy has been working out a very detailed and thoughtful, and in Tushnet's, evaluation, wrong, but serious jurisprudence over the past, 30 or 40 years, however long he's been on. So I don't think that Harlan Crow is like, go easy on that case. When Hitler comes before the Supreme Court, give him a pass or anything like that.
Peter, you're a proceduralist. In your view, has Clarence Thomas violated policy here?
That's a difficult question to answer because, in fact, it seems that part of the confusion is whether or not the forms and the requirements themselves were really all that clear. And there's a good James Taranto piece in the Wall Street Journal that basically argues that that Clarence Thomas probably mistakenly filled out a form, but not with anything that resembles malice. And he just needs to go back and issue a correction. And if you look at the form, the forms that are in question here, ProPublica seems to have misread to some extent how the disclosures were done by misunderstanding the nature of the property in question. And also Clarence Thomas may have misunderstood the requirements, though it's pretty clear that he has tried, right? There's not a lot of evidence of like really aiming to deceive or like it's just like he's sort of mislabeled or confusingly labeled something. So again, I think it's just genuinely difficult to tell. And that is part of the I think the difficulty of talking about this is that in some ways these ethics requirements end up being about finances and about taxes, but also about your friends and your personal life. And they're very complicated in some ways in the way that taxes are, right? And so anybody who knows anything about taxes, right, knows that especially if you have a little bit more money and if you have any sort of complexity to your taxes, say, for example, bank accounts in the United States and another country. Just even if you have
me mad.
Right. Like,
why
so
are you trying to get me mad?
I wouldn't know anything about this. I don't think anybody on our podcast has like any experience with this. That process gets very complicated to the point where two IRS employees might look at the same form and the same set of the same tax form and say, and one of them might say, oh, this is fine. You've done what you need to do. And another one might say, oh, no, this is not fine. You really have not. And you will get conflicting and different information even from the IRS because it is actually unclear. And I think that's probably the case here. And it does not seem to me as if there was any obvious malice or attempt to deceive here. I think what Nick said is directionally correct here in a lot of ways, just in terms of the thinking about how power operates. And this is one of the reasons why I have really mixed feelings about all of this is that if you are a conservative legal luminary in the way that Justice Thomas is, it's just not that surprising that you would end up having some sort of genuine social and personal connection to someone else who is a quite powerful, in this case because of his wealth, conservative persona. And in the same way that like Bill Clinton palled around with Hollywood celebrities, right? Like that type of person ends up being in the same room together. And sometimes they find they have a genuine friendly connection. And when that happens, how do you say to Supreme Court justices, hey, you can't have friends who have net wealths over a certain amount? That seems unreasonable. On the other hand, when it ends up leading us into circumstances like this. Also, as much as I appreciate Nick's good effort, I would have called this segment As the Crow Lies.
Good
God.
God.
That's even worse. Even worse.
Liz Wolfe, two-part question. Part one, how many times have you been on a super yacht? And then part two, should we be upset at the idea of Sonia Sotomayor on a super yacht in South Beach with George Soros?
It's a one piece or a bikini?
Yeah.
So if it's a super yacht, what are its powers?
Okay.
No. So there is a technical definition of a super yacht. That's something that I think frequently gets muddled in this reporting. And if I were editing it, I would be fastidious and meticulous about ensuring we're sticking to that actual definition. But two, I think there's so much bad media reporting on this type of thing. It's dripping with disdain for the rich by nature of them being rich, but not necessarily drawing this clear causal relationship between he was palling around with Harlan Crow and therefore he is compromised in X, Y, and Z ways, which I understand. That's a very difficult relationship to establish. But there are so many parts of this that are just terribly reported on. I think, number one, we should not sleep on the true smoking gun here, which is that Harlan Crow's resort has a life-size replica of Harry Potter character Hagrid's hut, as well as a 1950s-style soda fountain where Crow's staff fixes milkshakes.
Wait, I hope those are
is
the
Clarence
same-
Thomas enjoying the 1950s-style soda
I
fountain?
really
he's
hope
not
those are the
allowed.
same-
He's not
Well,
allowed to
exactly.
sit there, right? Yeah.
But
Can
I
we
mean,
have
the
the soda
idea of,
fountain
like-
inside the hut?
Well, the idea of being a billionaire and choosing to make a life-size replica of Hagrid's hut, like I think there are bigger problems here with Harlan Crow, right? Like that seems worthy of an ethics investigation on its own. But I mean, so many parts of this were so poorly reported on. You saw that Washington Post article about, Clarence Thomas allegedly failing to report rental income and really trying to just throw a whole kitchen sink of damning allegations at him. Okay, I directly quote from it. In total, he has reported receiving between $270,000 to $750,000 from the firm since 2006, describing it as rent. Thomas's salary as a justice this year is $285,000. Okay, this is from 2006. That's over the course of 17 years. If it's $750,000 total over 17 years, we're talking $45,000 in rental income that's gone unreported per year. If it's the bottom end of that range, it's about $16,000.
So wait, but you're not saying like, so he should just get a pass?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying I think that there's a little bit of dishonesty, a little bit of possible sleight of hand there because,
juxtaposing numbers that are apples and oranges.
And over the course of 17 years, all you need to do is like divide. I'm terrible at math and I managed to do that. And I'm sorry, but like $16,000 in misreported or underreported rental income, doesn't seem like the most. I think they're trying to construct this case that Clarence Thomas is living high on the hog. And I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Well, he clearly is, though, right? And his wife makes a lot of money. I mean, they're in the top 5%, if not 1%, probably, of household income earners.
Yeah, sure. But I think there's just this attempt to make the misstep, to the extent that it exists, far more egregious than it perhaps actually is. If you say to somebody, $750,000, misreported or underreported, that feels really different than saying $16,000 annually.
I think what you see in a lot of the press coverage is now every time there's a new one like the ones this morning, it's a pattern. So Clarence Thomas has a pattern.
This is what we said about Hillary Clinton and what the fuck was the scandal in Arkansas?
Whitewater?
Thank you.
Come on.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, but the thing that's bothering me is the reporting of this. I would be totally fine if they fixated on one specific allegation and made a pretty unimpeachable, clear case as to why it has compromised his ability to be a jurist. But what they do instead is another thing from that Washington Post article, quoting Stephen Gillers, a legal ethics expert at NYU. Direct quote, Gillers said all three branches of government should investigate Thomas's compliance or non-compliance with federal ethics law. The Supreme Court has been the glue that has held the Republic together since 1790, with the Civil War the only interruption. We need the public to respect it, even when it disagrees with it, and to understand why it is important. Generally, the public has, he said, but that respect is now in serious jeopardy, and others must do something to stop the freefall. First of all, do somethingism, love that. Number two, what does he mean? Do you guys feel like the Supreme Court has in some way, totally jeopardized its own institutional credibility? I feel like actually there is a significant component of this, which is bad journalism and activist journalism that's attempting to sort of undermine the credibility. We saw, we've been seeing decades and decades of character assassinations during confirmation hearings, which now we've sort of come to expect. But
even happened to Clarence Thomas, if I remember correctly. It's been a while.
It was a high-tech lynching by his own court.
We saw this with Amy Coney Barrett trying to act like she's a psychotic Catholic cultist. And I know you have thoughts about the Catholic
I think merely
Church.
revealing.
Revealing.
No, and I think she would agree with that characterization.
I mean, even the way the journalists covered a lot of the Brett Kavanaugh proceedings, I mean, I'm sorry, but some of those accusers, like Michael Avenatti client Julie Swetnick, were not particularly credible. We could talk all day about the Christine Blasey Ford account, but ultimately there was a very concerted effort on the part of what I view as kind of lefty activist journalists to try to
but there's also
undermine
that
the credibility of
I agree
people.
with you completely, and there's also that on the right to discredit left-wing jurists and things like that.
Absolutely.
For me, this is why what I find interesting about this is what it reveals about the power elite in America, and we oftentimes think about. Well, there's, the economically powerful, there's the politically powerful, and then there's people like Supreme Court justices who, in many ways control as much of our daily lives as anybody else. And it's always interesting to me to see what are the connections between and among these people. And then Ginny Thomas, I mean, this is part of the reason why they're, I think gunning along these lines is because of all the stuff about Ginny Thomas, who worked at Heritage Foundation and has a lot of political action stuff. And again, I don't think any of this stuff is necessarily unethical or, it needs to be punished. But I find it very useful to understand, who knows whom. I think I've told this story before, and it's very short, or this observation. I remember I used to love watching This Week with David Brinkley, just because he was so wry and interesting. And then I remembered learning, and he seemed to keep Washington power at bay. And then I learned that, he had a vacation home in North Carolina where he hung out with, a bunch of leading politicians. And I was so disappointed that he was friends with these people. And again, it's, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's I think it's good that we know that these people who run our lives, or try to run our lives, I think they mostly fail, but that these connections exist. And I think that's good to know.
My favorite part of the ProPublica original story is the, to Liz's point, they tried to emphasize little extra spice on there to make you think that it was even worse. So the Adirondacks compound that Harlan Crow was living in with, I don't know if that has the Hagrid hut or whatever, but it was designed by the same architect who did Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
Enough said. Enough
Wait,
said.
I'm just pinning that to the board. That completes the circle.
The stuff about Ginny Thomas and the degree to which she was possibly involved in election result overturning efforts, to me, that's extremely damning. That's a thing that I want to pay attention to.
So you're blaming a guy for his wife?
Always.
He should control his woman.
For better
he should keep
or
her
for
under
worse.
better control. I mean,
why is she even working?
How could he be a successful jurist if he can't even keep his own women in line? And the kids kitchen
God.
barefoot and pregnant. No, but I mean, I do think that it is important to sort of pay attention to this bullshit reporting whenever it crops up. And I think we saw that a lot with the Harlan Crow Garden of Evil type thing.
That was terrible.
I'm sorry, but like just because you are a collector of something or merely present and interested in something for its historical significance, or to even like I follow Instagram accounts about that display propaganda from different awful totalitarian regimes. That's not because I'm excited about Mao. It's because I think it's interesting to see how these terrible regimes portrayed themselves and tried to convince the people.
This is also, I
of
mean,
the
on
truth.
point, Matt's, interest, his collection in child pornography.
CSAM, as we
Yeah.
like to refer
It's
to
tax
it.
day. No, I don't want that to report. Peter, to kind of this point, you see reaction to this story or these ongoing revelations of stories on the left of like, look, there's nothing that the right won't excuse when it comes to Clarence Thomas. There's no revelation that's going to move them an inch. And then on the right, you see people saying there's no opportunistic detail that won't be used. There's no bit of outrage archaeology that won't be dug up to throw at a person that they've been going after since 1990. Are they both right? And if so, how much should we start drinking in the morning?
Yes, and stick with classic breakfast drinks like the Morning Glory Fizz. And late 1800s, 2 ounces of scotch, but like some club soda. And it's kind of like a Ramos Gin Fizz. You get this great big head of fizz if you make it right. There's a little bit of citrus in there, right? Just to, kind of keep things flavorful. I mean, like that's the obvious response to this is bring back breakfast cocktails with a lot of scotch.
Are we doing
in them.
egg whites in the fizz? Or
In some
no?
cases, yes.
Okay, good.
Is there a vegan option on that?
Well, you could take the egg white out.
All right, but then it's not going to fizz.
It will, actually, if you do the club soda right. You just got to pour it. It's a whole technique situation.
Harlan Crow knows how to do this, right? Why don't you, Nick?
The other thing that is worth, and Jesse Walker has written about this at Reason, is more than these kinds of questions are whether or not the justices who are actually sitting and oftentimes sleeping, whether or not they're mentally incompetent. And people like William Douglas, he was showing up for years after he retired as if he was still a Supreme Court justice. And it's kind of like that didn't start when he retired. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was like clearly, one burp could have killed her for a couple of years. She retired,
Her burp or
she
Scalia's?
proactively retired. But I mean, there's a long history of mentally incompetent justices that goes beyond anything related to ideology. And that, I hate to sound like Nikki, what's her name? I'm sorry, it's too early in the morning for me.
Finky?
11 o'clock, yeah.
No, by the way, that
Nikki,
is how I hope
Hopkins?
to retire from this
Governor
podcast.
Nikki
Haley.
Haley, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that
No,
after
she, 75 years, maybe you got to start taking a driving test.
Peter, finish your
Before you
thought.
sit.
that is how I hope
Succinctly.
to retire from this podcast, just to to not be on it anymore and then just show up every Monday morning.
Oh, that sounds great. All right, well, let's shift gears here. A couple weeks back, some classified U.S. intelligence leaks started appearing on Twitter, on Telegram, on 4chan, all these places that I know really well, many of them having to do with Russia-Ukrainian war, as well as some internal stuff involving U.S. allies such as Israel. Among other revelations were that there are apparently 14 U.S. military personnel on the ground in Ukraine, and the fight there isn't going as swimmingly for the defenders as has been portrayed. After a week or so of this info coming out, it was traced to a small Discord group, is that how we call them? Led by
Community.
its so-called OG, Jack Teixeira, and who is posting and copying documents to a small group of young compadres in order to impress them, reportedly. He was arrested, Teixeira, on live television last week. Peter, what have we learned from the leaks? Are they important? Are they damaging? Do they tell us something about our classification system that's worth chewing on?
Well, they probably tell us that a lot of classified things should not be classified, especially since, on the one hand, they are classified, and on the other hand, they appear to be open to just about anyone and everyone with any kind of connection to the U.S. military, which is a huge, huge, huge group of people, including guys like the leaker, who can then post this on their meme forums. And that, like, when you have this wide of access to the top secret details about the U.S.'s assessment of what's going on in probably the most consequential military conflict, certainly going on in the world right now, but of the last couple of decades, like, yeah, that stuff gets turned into dank memes, guys. The New York Times ran a report on the specific forum that this came out of, which was called the End of Wow Mao Zone. Speaking, probably Harlan Crow is really big into this, or at least Liz Wolfe, right? Because she follows all the propaganda. And the person running it just had this to say, that the leaked documents surfacing there that they had surfaced there of all places was, quote, hilarious. It was just spread onto the nichiest, nerdiest parts of the internet. That's the kind of people who would find these documents losers. That's who the U.S. government really has to fear. This person, Wow Mao, also said they'll always find it funny to mock them and cut under them in some sort of way. If this were the plot of like some sort of Silicon Valley Veep mashup, we would have been like, okay, that's funny, but that's a little bit exaggerated. But no, the 2023 is the most bonkers. Like, it's really perfectly online and perfectly indicative of the kind of absurd, always the weird online culture that we now live in. And this just sort of gets to something that I think a lot of people probably who listen to this podcast sort of understand, but haven't really gotten beamed into their skulls in a deep way, which is that there is a huge, huge, huge amount of discourse and discussion that is happening sub rosa, outside of the mainstream or even the kind of nominally niche media platforms like Substack, that people actually know. Just a ton of this stuff that is happening totally outside of it, and that the gatekeepers and the adults in the room, the New York Times types, but even people like us at Reason, who kind of think of ourselves as alive to the weirdness of online culture, are just not at all aware of. And sometimes it includes leaking classified military secrets.
Nick, you're alive to the weirdness at all times. There's been some reaction to this. Tucker Carlson, quite a few libertarians, the Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi,
Marjorie Taylor Greene,
axis of Marjorie Taylor Greene's, who have portrayed this pretty dystopian terms.
Actually, I think it's just Marjorie Taylor now. Excuse me.
Okay, I didn't realize.
She's a traditionalist, so she is getting divorced.
I don't know if that's true, so just fact check out there yourself. But do they have a point? Is this a dystopian example of how, if you oppose the war in any meaningful sense, that you're going to get cracked down on and you're going to have helicopters outside your house and pulled and taken away?
Yeah, and Tucker Carlson actually said, that in today's America, telling the truth is the only real sin, and that Teixeira, not related to Mark Teixeira, by the way, who hit over 400 home runs, which is kind of amazing, don't you think?
Well, he didn't resign with
in a journeyman career. But he also then said that he's being treated like Osama bin Laden, maybe a little worse.
Maybe
a little worse. Okay, yeah, let's
it's foreshadowing.
But I find this, what Peter is talking about is genuinely fascinating. There are tons of classified documents floating all over the place, and the question of who leaks them, or at least who gets blamed for the leaks, is really interesting, and it tends to be younger people. Last week, I released a podcast with former Reason staffer Kerry Howley, whose book Bottoms Up and the Devil Laughs, A Journey Through the Deep State, is kind of all about this. And people like Edward Snowden, Reality Winner, Daniel Hale, Julian Assange, even going back to the 60s, Daniel Ellsberg. He was a little bit older. All of these other people were under 30. Ellsberg was in his 30s when he leaked the Pentagon Papers.
He was young at heart.
Yeah, and he still is young at heart. Yeah. It's fascinating because what we have is a security state that is in place and that has, we've documented this at Reason since 9/11 at the very least, just the massive expansion of what gets classified as a document, as a secret document has grown. At the same time, the world has changed and like younger people, particularly people serving in the military or in a kind of affiliated contractor jobs, don't think about things in the same way. And this is, it's as if McDonald's was still acting as if it was 1970 and they were making you wear hairnets and show up wearing hard shoes and you'd be sent home from work if you didn't have the perfect outfit on. And, this is really on the military. It's a failure of the deep state, which has been failing again and again and again in all sorts of ways. And this is just one of those things. I think this is a good sign. In the sense that we want to know what the government is doing and what the government is saying about things as much as possible, short of actual treason during a shooting war. It's one thing if you're Henry Kaiser and you're selling aluminum or something to the Germans as we are invading Germany. All of this other stuff, the real topic has to be, are the documents real? Are the revelations real? And then what do they say about government power? And the other stuff, it needs to be adjudicated. You can't have people in the military who are just, calling audibles and leaking whatever they want. But that's really kind of like a third order problem. And it's good to know what the government is thinking about the war in Ukraine.
From a cultural perspective,
Liz,
it's also just notable that this was a forum that revolved heavily around video games and guns. And that's the kind of person who is just who is online a huge percentage of the time, but probably not reading a whole lot of New York Times front page news and sort of thinking about the latest congressional revelations in Politico. They're experiencing just a totally different online discourse landscape than a lot of the folks who actually have, who we think of as having big platforms and a lot of power in today's media.
And the military is recruiting from that pool as well. Liz, you're a youth.
Well, if I may just to put a button on that too, and this is in Kerry's book, David Petraeus gave away 15 notebooks of classified material to his lover/biographer and didn't get in any trouble for it. He kind of got he retired a little bit early, whereas people like Reality Winner who leaked a document that, suggested that it was a government document that was accurate that suggested that the Russians were trying to influence the 2016 election, which was a true document, even if the Russians didn't end up doing that very well. But these are we should be much more worried about David Petraeus and a bunch of liars who are at the very top of the military-industrial complex than something like this.
And Sandy Berger's pants, which is just always important to say. Liz, you're a youth. Speak for your generation.
I will actually play the Katherine Mangu-Ward card here, the role, and note that the Carrie Howley book that you are talking about is something that is an excerpt of that is actually running in the forthcoming issue of Reason magazine, that thing that we make together. And so subscribers ought to check that out. It's fascinating. It's a very, very hard book to even summarize because of how creative and bizarre and just narratively complex and delightful it is. So I highly recommend that. There is also a certain patheticness to this guy that feels like a sign of the times. You mentioned Daniel Ellsberg, you mentioned Reality Winner, I don't know if you mentioned Chelsea Manning in there, or where you would plot yourself on the Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning traitor hero matrix. I don't know if you're familiar with that meme, Nick.
Yeah, I am.
Have you seen it on your Discord boards? But I think there's a certain patheticness to this guy. He's trying to impress 16-year-olds on a gaming message boards. He's not trying to whistleblow and give these types of documents to somebody so that they will see the light of day in order to call attention to government malfeasance. He's trying to basically, he's just going about this in the dumbest possible way of trying to make 15 and 16-year-olds think he's hot shit. It's just a very pathetic way of doing things, and I'm confused about what type of motivation he has.
You have a teenage daughter. Wouldn't you leak national security secrets in order to look cool to your daughter?
I would like to Fiona Hill this to Matt. Not that I have the expertise that she did, but your Bill Maher appearance where she basically just awkwardly punted on foreign policy questions and was like, hey, Matt, you know Central Europe, NATO, go.
That was so weird,
It was really weird. I also always get Fiona Hill and Fiona Apple confused.
I was just going to say, I was thinking for a second we're back to child porn.
They both feel...
Right? No! Matt's a criminal. I think Matt filmed that was
But
filmed at Matt
Matt, you have thoughts and expertise on this, given all your Discord time. So why don't you begin?
But you have to answer in the form of Fiona Apple lyrics. When the idler
appreciate
wheel,
both.
etc.
I don't know. There's a tunnel under Ocean Boulevard.
It's a different one, man. That's Lana
they're
Del
all
Rey.
The same. They're all the same.
Lana Del Rey is
now,
so much better
There
than
is
Fiona Apple.
such
I'll
a
put that out
world
there.
of difference between Fiona Apple and Lana Del Rey. I mean,
invite
60 pounds of raw sexuality, man.
Okay, we're going to transition to our listener email question of the week, and yes, that's me just spiking that volleyball before it even comes close to the net. That doesn't make any sense at all. We're going to get to our listener email question of the week in a moment. But first, Andrew Heaton is one of the funny people in Reason TV videos, such as Libertarian Star Trek and Libertarian Star Wars. So it won't surprise you to discover that he hosts a science fiction podcast called Alienating the Audience. Sorry for laughing out loud. Alienating the Audience does deep dives on science fiction, like Robert A. Heinlein's Free Love Libertarianism, the economics of Dune, Kurt Vonnegut and the Warfare State, and how Star Wars Andor loves public choice theory. Guests on the show have included Peter Boghossian on what the first contact with aliens will be like, Jonathan Last from the Bulwark defending the Empire, Tim Sandefur, of the Goldwater Institute on Star Trek's Cold War hot takes, and even Katherine Mangu-Ward has joined to discuss the work of Dan Simmons. If you don't like science fiction, do not listen to Alienating the Audience, as there's an excellent chance your virginity will grow back. But if you do like science fiction with a little extra dollop of politics and economics served fresh by a mid-level comedian, then check out Alienating the Audience wherever you get your podcasts. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. Okay, reminder to email us your brief queries to roundtable@reason.com. This winningly brief one comes from Fred Atwater, which is just an excellent detective name, I think. Fred Atwater. Fred Atwater, Private Eye.
God damn it, Atwater. If you weren't the best PI, I would have your ass in a sling.
In the current issue of Reason, Fred Atwater asks, one of the debate topics is, it's time for a national divorce, with the separation assumed to be between red and blue factions. Given the current policies of each, would you choose the red, Trump, DeSantis, Taylor, Greene, or blue, AOC, Sanders, Warren side? Why? Thank you. Liz, you are the professional red-blue straddler of this group. Why don't you lead off?
Well, my revealed preferences indicate Team Blue because I live in this garbage hellscape of New York City where the M train leaves you stuck on the Williamsburg Bridge, suspended in midair for 10 fucking minutes. But I must say, fully Team Red, no shame there. The reasons are because just filed taxes, and during years where my husband and I have been living in Austin, you do all of the federal tax filing, and you get to the point in TurboTax where it says select your state, and you select Texas, and it says, okay, great, no state income tax, you're done. Or you select New York, and it takes longer than it actually took to file the federal income taxes, and it's miserable, and we end up owing New York a shit ton of money. It's absolutely awful. I have a 6-month-old child, and so, the stakes got higher. Now my decision as to where I want to base myself is less about what I personally enjoy and a little bit more about what type of future I want for him. And the fact of the matter is, in New York, he sleeps in a closet, which we're able to sort of cutely brand as like a mini room right now.
Harry Potter.
Yeah, how special. But at a certain point, like when he's 16 years old and 6'4", it's going to be a big problem and it's going to look a lot like child abuse. So that's definitely something on my mind. The fact that, I'm asked for his pronouns when filling out daycare applications, when I just feel like I'm failing him because he cannot speak. And so I'm not able to fully understand what his pronouns are.
But you're using
but there feels
he
to be
right now.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll hate me for this and end up in therapy as a result of it. Even just dumb things like the fact that New York Department of Education has spent $200,000 over the last few years on a drag queen story hour in public schools and public libraries, which that's a tiny, tiny little minuscule bit of the Department of Education budget. And there is also an equally insidious and miserable form of that type of culture war nonsense that's happening in like Florida public schools, right? Like I don't want my kid to be a pawn in DeSantis's battle or in any New York State or city culture warring. All of this sounds so objectionable to me, and I find that Austin is the better mix of policies, and I feel like there's a certain amount of maybe higher likelihood of someday being able to take advantage of school choice if we're Texas-based versus New York-based. Ultimately, I would love to free my kid from a lot of this nonsense. I really dislike the amount of performative wokeness, culture war signaling that happens among a certain subset of Brooklyn parent culture. And that happens in all kinds of places. That would happen in a place like Florida, and I don't particularly want to to opt into something like that. But I really do feel like Texas is a little bit better of a balance, and I am hopeful that someday in the future I can fully jump over to Team Red and pocket a lot more of my cash and ideally, have a little bit of money funding that can follow my kid versus necessarily having to send him to public schools where they will be teaching him things that I don't necessarily agree with or think are age appropriate.
God. Just a quick correction there, or clarification. There's no if about your kid going to therapy. You live in New York; it's mandatory. Nick, give us a little blue state pushback on our red Karen over here.
Well, I find the discussion of a national divorce to be one of the dumbest arguments.
You
just
can't
ongoing.
just reject the premise, though. You have to
Sure, I
entertain
can.
the
This
world.
is still America.
Yeah.
At least for a couple of years more. And I remember first encountering that where I had a drunken encounter with Todd Rundgren in a bar in Los Angeles shortly after the 2004 election, and I was the only person in the place that recognized him. And so I bought him a drink and then started talking to him and drunkenly misquoting his lyrics to him and things like that. But obviously, he had to listen because I was the only one paying attention to him. And he was talking about how, Hawaii and California and a bunch of places should just secede from the country. And this was a big thing. You'll remember, Matt, after John Kerry mysteriously lost, one of the shittiest presidential candidates of all time running against. Yeah. And I've always thought that the divorce rhetoric is stupid. And it's never going to happen. I have chosen to move back to New York at a point in my life where I can afford to do it. I would rather that it cost less money. I wish the city were better run. I wish the state were better run. I have lived in Texas. I've lived in Ohio. I've lived in California. I've lived in Maryland. I've lived all over the place in blue states, red states, and purple states. And the best states are the or rather, I realized when I was living in a prison town in Texas, a very red state and a very red town and a very red state, that there's, we talk about the cost of living, there's also a demand for living. And nobody wanted to live in a prison town, even though the taxes were essentially zero. And they had low property taxes and local taxes too. I pay a premium to live in New York City because I like the culture. And paradoxically, and I suspect that we'll talk about this when we do our live recording in New York City. And notice we're doing it in New York City. We're not doing it in Huntsville, Texas. But you pay a premium to be where the action is.
Well, the Comedy Cellar location in Huntsville is pretty sparsely attended.
It's mandatory. Yeah. If it's in the prison, if it's in the Walls unit on execution night, you get a big crowd. But,
Peter, choose a team.
Well, one answer is that I would choose to live in D.C. because I already live in D.C. I own a house in D.C. My wife's job is in D.C. and Reason's office is in D.C. And that's a lot of reasons to stay in D.C. Another answer is I might choose a red state, but only if you could find me a dense, walkable city with a great food, booze, and art scene that is also, and this is important, someplace that is relatively cool in climate, right? Like I want to live under Texas's laws with New York's scene and cultural amenities, but Portland, Maine's weather. And sadly, that does not exist.
I will tack on to this, not rejecting the premise, but answering that if there were something as stupid as a national divorce based on policies or politics, I would leave the dumb country for one where politics and policies are not as up in people's minds as this
Going
one.
back to Hungary, aren't you? Just can't wait.
Probably, I want to go to the Danube
Politics is
Institute. I
better.
understand they have some fellowships there, just waiting for me.
Yeah. No, you
long
and
as-
Chris Rufo. That'd be a hell of a water cooler conversation.
Bathhouse conversation, not a water
that's
cooler
true.
conversation. Or
Yeah,
even
with Rod
sauna
Dreyer as
conversation.
towel boy.
Do you know what the leading beer is in Hungary? It's called Dreher.
Oh my
It's
God.
pronounced
My
or
God.
spelled the same way. Is that an
Where-
All
accident?
coming
Where would
together.
you go, though? Would you go
Yeah,
back
what
to
country?
This I don't know. You're putting me on the spot. I don't exactly know.
Latin America? It's time to shine.
Uh,
Cuba failed,
Cuba.
but yeah, Cuba.
I'm going to give Cuba another shot. No, this is actually a lead into our next lightning round since we're running out of time here and certain people have things to do, which is all of us. But per Liz's point on taxes, it's astonishing to think about, and I'm thinking about it now because literally tomorrow is tax day, that my state and local tax check that I wrote was twice as large as the one that I wrote to the federal government. And there are plenty of places that don't have the state and local. New York City has income tax, and it's really a great pleasure for all the great services. That
Why is your how? I mean, you are.
don't cross-examine my finances
All right.
live,
Okay.
Nick. That's for the green room afterwards. Let's go to our lightning round, which is that Tuesday is tax day, and so taxes. We already have heard are super annoying to Liz. Peter pointed out that they're annoying to me. Nick apparently loves to pay taxes, so that's cool. Let's go around quickly and say what annoys us the most this year about tax day. Liz Wolfe, you write about taxes and the IRS a lot. What say you?
The most annoying thing to me personally, other than the fact that I can't afford to live in New York City, is the fact that the IRS was tasked with filing a report about how they will use the $80 billion new dollars in funding, and they were given a deadline, and they were 48 days late to file. And I do not think that I personally, if I were 48 days late to file my own taxes, would be able to get off scot-free the way that they have. And so I find that double standard to be real icky. And I think also the fact that $3.2 billion of that funding will be devoted to taxpayer services over the next decade or so, but $45.6 billion will go toward enforcement. So that's something that leaves me a little anxious about my audit risk as somebody who straddles Texas and New York and also occasionally tweets things like "fuck the IRS," which I probably should stop doing.
Nick?
The thing that always that I hate is at the end when at the state level they always say like, do you want to contribute to the California fund for blah 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 or New York State, and it's like, no, I really don't. If I wanted to, I would do that. And in TurboTax and other programs, they ask you like 3 times. I mean, it's like they're trying to convert you to Judaism or
It's
something.
like trying to use the automated checker at CVS.
Yeah.
It's like,
It's
our veterans?
Yeah, and it's
No.
just like enough already because tax day is already fraught for all of the reasons that people have articulated here. So, that last question, it's like one too much.
Peter?
The thing I hate the most is when I see the number, the dollar figure for the amount of taxes that I pay each year. It's so much money. It's just so much money.
Do you play the game where like you add it up and think what you could buy with it and stuff? Or like how do you process that money besides the anger?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have like a whole additional bar I could be building every single year with that money.
You could be constructing an artificial liver.
I could be building a Harry Potter replica house and putting a cocktail bar in it. Every single
I
year.
think someone just got an idea.
What would the Draco?
1950s
What would
style
Draco
soda.
Malfoy's cocktail be?
I think it probably would be in the white Negroni family.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
That's pretty clear.
White supremacist Negroni.
My perennial irritation is, as foreshadowed by Peter earlier in the podcast, all of the extensive disclosures that are required if you or your joint filer have bank accounts or stuff in foreign financial institutions, the amount of detail that you need to include, which includes the high water mark in the previous year according to the exchange rate of how much said account was worth, regardless if there's $10 in it or 10,000 or 100,000 in it, under very severe penalties. It just some people will say, like, why don't you use TurboTax? Like, dude, TurboTax is not set up to deal with that kind of complexity. I highly recommend everyone reacquainting themselves with Donald Rumsfeld's historic letter to the IRS. It should be printed on a Scott Lincecum style T-shirt every single year. It's just terrific. Where he says,
I want to say that I felt good because I came to that moment where it's like, do you or anybody in your family, like on this filing, have overseas stuff? And I was like, no, I don't, but Matt Welch does. Yeah. And that made me feel a little better. I was almost ready to give to a New York State fund.
That's my usual one. But then this year, a couple of days ago on Twitter, I don't know why I follow some New York City 311 account. I guess, maybe during a Superstorm Sandy, it was giving detailed information. But they did this little hey, there's still time left to take advantage of our free tax preparation software. Just go here. And everything was just like smiley faces and cartoons. And it's like, no, it's not happy. Stop pretending that it's happy and stop taxing people, New York City, because you ain't providing anything worth a crap. Not even the rat czar is worth it for New York City. All right, let's get to our end of podcast, what we are consuming in the cultural arena. Peter, why don't you lead us
I
off?
saw John Wick 4, and it is, I really mean this, one of the best action movies I've seen, certainly in the last decade or so, but maybe one of the best action movies ever. It's almost 3 hours long, and it earns just about every minute of it. There's a series of sequences in the final 45 minutes or so that are just delightfully bonkers. Like, there's literally a 10-minute bit in which John Wick is outside the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and he's just running between cars and kind of alternately punching, throwing, and shooting all of these guys who are driving around the Arc de Triomphe in a circle while he's punching and shooting them and pulling them out of cars and throwing them into other cars and then getting other cars to knock into each other. And it's just like, it's so bonkers. You cannot believe what you are seeing on screen. It's not even so much that you can't believe that it was executed. You can't believe that someone thought of this in this elaborate detail and then actually pulled it off. And
with the dog.
So, well, the dog is a little earlier in the series here, but it's funny and it's comic in a really zany, creative way, and just sort of shows the paucity of imagination and thought that goes into so many modern action sequences. Because somebody really tried to make every one of these sequences just like a total banger, just like something you have never ever seen before. And in that way, it's cartoon like, right? It's almost like watching Murder Looney Tunes, and I mean that in the best possible way. But it's not just funny, and it's not just that the gags are all really great. It is not so subtly a sad tale about a man trying to figure out what to do with his life after he loses his purpose, because he is a killer. He is the very best killer. That is his job, and he is just a kind of excellent craftsman. And he retires, and he wants to retire with his wife, and his wife dies because, well, sometimes people die, and that's sad. And so he's like, all right, what am I going to do now? I guess I'll get a dog and drive my cool car around and just satisfy myself that way. And then the bad guys kill his dog, and he's like, all right, I guess I'm going to have to murder all of you now. And in the end, he kind of murders all of them. He finds his freedom again. He's like, well, what do I do now? And he doesn't know. And that's sort of the end. And it's this weirdly like zany comic, incredibly energetic film that also has this real sort of sad, sort of middle-aged, like late middle-aged life crisis undertone to it it's amazing that they pull off the tonal shifts here. It's also just amazing some of the stuff you see on screen. And if you get to watch, if you can Google for any of the videos of Keanu Reeves rehearsing the sequences, and you see what he is doing, just like when it's being shot on like an iPhone while he's wearing blue jeans and just working out in a studio, and you see how fast and how quick he is and how he actually learned all these moves and sequences in sequence. So it's not just being cut up right into one move after one shot, one move. It's really incredible, and just an incredible testament to what a a perfect physical actor he remains even as he's approaching 60.
Speaking of the physical actor, the dude who plays Kane was pretty amazing, although I hear he's a red Chinese commie, but he was really good. Nick, what did you consume?
I have been reading Great Expectations, America and the Baby Boom Generation by Landon Y. Jones, which came out in 1980. And it was, by legend, it is the book that turned the boomers into the boomers. It was written by one of their own in 1980 as the boom was starting to move fully into the positions of power and influence and control, kind of cultural, economic, and political production in the country, because there had been a lot of different names for the baby. Like, everybody knew there was a baby boom, but they were called the Me generation, the Pepsi generation,
Right.
all sorts of things. What is fascinating to me about it, and again, to read it as the generation is kind of setting itself up to take over the country, it's so everything in it is reminiscent of the cultural shift that's happening now between boomers and millennials, and to some degree Gen Z. And I just want to read a passage which relevant to the discussion that we had a week or 2 weeks ago about TikTok and about how, everybody's like, the communist Chinese don't even allow TikTok because everybody's doing all the kids are doing calculus. Over here, we're doing dance crazes and, falling off the milk crates. So this is in the late 50s when Sputnik went up. The scapegoating began with the schools. Suddenly, the entire country discovered that while American youth were idly humming Jimmy Rogers' Honeycomb, the number one song that Sputnik week, little Ivan was ruthlessly studying long division. Alarming reports flowed from Russia of tough and purposeful Soviet schools, stressing the sciences and placing little stock in civics. Soviet teachers were creating little geniuses in the fourth grade and training them to develop bigger and even more frightening rockets and Sputniks. They were bravely shouldering formidable homework assignments while American kids played Davy Crockett. And it's like every fucking paragraph in this book is like, oh my God, we are doing exactly the same thing, but just 40 years later. And it's wonderful to see the way that generational discourse gets discussed. It's a wonderful book, Great Expectations by Landon Y. Jones.
Calls to mind, I wrote a piece about Field of Dreams, and which came out in 1989. And as part of that, just sort of researching the top grossing baseball movies, and 2/3 of them, 10 of the top 15 came out within a 10-year period between 84 and 94. And also Field of Dreams, and I didn't really think about this until I started reading about it more deeply, was like right in the heart of boomer cinema. And you can think about it, and I'm sure there's been books about it, but I'm just ignorant to be caught up. But basically between The Big Chill and Forrest Gump, that was that period. And so this book is the Big Chill equivalent.
Yeah.
When Big Chill arrived, it's like, oh my God.
And
they're playing, you can't always get what you want at the funeral.
Yeah, and I remember also at one point, I think Kevin Kline says, like, no, we're not playing any new music in this house. And they fucking put on Motown, et cetera. And I remember thinking, like, this is why people hate boomers and why boomers hated their parents. Because it's like, no, everything stopped when I was 30 or whatever. Yeah. I loved in your piece about Field of Dreams, the whole boomer thing, because I can remember that scene where the wife shouts down somebody at a school board meeting, and it's like, oh, we're boomers, and it's like, God, you're such a fucking asshole, and we're replaying that. But now it's millennials are kind of the fucking assholes, as are boomers, et cetera. But it's
as always, Gen X wins, as Liz Wolfe knows.
Well, but Gen X is such a small, it's a pimple on the back of a boil, I was going to say the other thing, just very briefly, to annoy people that aren't into baseball.
Yeah.
The natural, which, comes out in the thick of the decade that you're talking about, is such a profound misinterpretation of the source material that was written by somebody of the silent generation. And it is such a dark allegory of America. The Robert Redford movie is so bad, it really deserves to be like brutalized and eliminated from American cinema history. I highly recommend anybody who likes the natural read the Bernard Malamud book, which came out in like the early 50s, right around Catcher in the Rye. And it is so brilliant and so beautiful and wonderful and dark. And it's a great baseball novel, but it's really an allegory about America getting fat and lazy and taking its exceptionalism for granted. It's so beautiful. And that movie, when I saw it, I could not believe it. It was so bad. And in many ways, Robert Redford is the personification, even though I think he's a little too old to be a boomer, is the personification of what is wrong with the boomer generation.
Boom.
I am incredibly bored by this conversation.
Yeah.
However, I do want you to know that I would subscribe to your OnlyFans if Nick, Matt, and maybe Ethan Strauss could do some kind of segment on the declining rates of sports viewership among young people today, but especially baseball, which has been kind of hardest hit by this. Like basketball's audience has remained decent, but baseball especially has just nosedived. And I'm curious as to whether you guys have theories on what's going on or, what's happening there, because I try to go to Mets
Although
games
this
and
year,
Yankees games, and I just get stoned and I eat steak sandwiches.
Ethan Strauss, who's I recommend very highly, his House of Strauss Substack and podcast. He's a very smart guy. He's written about this, and he is arguing early in this baseball season that they might have arrested the slide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they made some procedural changes. We shall see. I'm a little bit optimistic, but we will take you up on that. One of these days, what have you been consuming, Liz Wolfe?
I have been consuming Outlive by Dr. Peter Attia. It is not explicitly libertarian or political, but there's a palpable strain of here's how the medical establishment has failed, here's how the incentives are bad, and here are ways that doctors are kind of, playing by the rules and very by the book and focused on precautionary principle and risk, basically, very risk averse, but they're not actually doing the things that they ought to by and large. Peter Attia basically used to be, I believe, a surgeon years and years ago and quit doing that and basically spun off into his own medical practice, was highly successful for many years in New York, and now is, I believe, Austin-based. Yet another example of people fleeing the evil city of New York. He has a big emphasis on health span in addition to lifespan, talking about how people in this country have awful diets, are extremely sedentary. This is especially interesting to me because every time I ride the train, I see those Subway ads for Wegovy and Ozempic, the new injectables that promise weight loss for those who take them. And that drug has an awful lot of promise. I know Barry Weiss has been covering this an awful lot on her podcast. I know Matt Iglesias has been doing a little bit of coverage on this. But there's something kind of messed up to me.
Are you suggesting Matt Welch take Ozempic with that?
With Matt Iglesias? Yeah. I'm suggesting that Matt Iglesias inject Matt Welch with Ozempic. No, but there's something that's very messed up to me about setting people up to be reliant on these shots, which possibly come with a whole host of side effects without also counseling them on how to maintain good diet and fitness and ensure that they can actually fully reform their lifestyle because, metabolic disorders are legit and there is a lot more to this than just fat versus thin. Attia focuses a lot on, are you pre-diabetic? How's your insulin response? Do you actually understand what's going on with your cholesterol? A lot of people have a very simplistic understanding of that. And average is just not the same as optimal. Attia does a really, really good job of talking about how the medical establishment is targeting these interventions once these issues within a person have already taken hold. And the fact of the matter is that you need to be intervening 20 years earlier. All of that is to say, drugs like Ozempic, I think, have a lot of promise. They're very interesting. There's no reason to be, tech phobic when it comes to new medical technology. But I think that, paying attention to new developments like that and the incredible promise that they hold, but pairing that with work like Attia's sort of gets you to the right place in terms of understanding a little bit more of a holistic picture of health and nutrition.
Thank you, Liz Wolfe. I have been consuming, or what I consumed, at the direction of my 8-year-old. We couldn't get the National Treasure 3 on our streaming devices, which is very distressing. So she had to call an audible, and she said, let's watch the documentary about the inside the mind of a cat. I'm like, all right, let's do that. So we watched a Netflix doc. It was pretty funny. It's pretty funny. And I just basically mentioned it to bait Peter Suderman, obviously. But the funny part is they catch up with researchers who are trying to figure out inside the mind. And the repeated thing among all these people, and they go from continent to continent looking for the truth about inside the mind of the cat, is that the research is 20 years behind that of dogs. Everyone says that dogs are like that, but we're just catching up now. And what's great is that every one of the researchers and every one of the really great like Ukrainian show cat family who talks about what the things that they've learned. Everyone is such a cat lady.
Are the show cats still alive?
Yeah,
they're Ukrainian.
Oh, they're great. They survived.
As a matter of fact, were people killing Russian blues in the streets like dachshunds during
when
World War One?
Yeah, that might have.
Yeah.
This came out in 2022.
Throwing Russian blues at Russians.
It was probably filmed a little bit before the invasion.
Matt, are you a cat or a dog person? I've always respected you as just an anti-pet person.
You're neither, right?
I have no pet in the house, and there won't be one. I grew up with both, one of each, and no natural preference.
I would have thought you would like
more
a snake person.
Dogs, I appreciate the loyalty and the human orientation, and cats are kind of jerks. But Peter, I'll give you a one-sentence response to hype people about your cats versus dogs cover image story debate in the debate issue, which is now fading from newsstands.
It's not the cover image. The cover image is great, but the real highlight of this issue is that my own dogs appear in photograph form, basically as a big spread in the middle of it, along with Jason Russell's not nearly as cute or attractive cat. And so I just think visually it's pretty obvious which one is better. My dogs are better than any cat, but you're gonna have to buy the issue and check it out for yourself.
All right, let's wrap this up because we're running late. Thank you for listening. We have next Tuesday the Reason Roundtable live here in New York City. Liz Wolfe will be in the audience if she shows up, not on the stage. She's not going. She's not going at all. But their tickets are running out if they exist at all. And if they have run out, you can bum rush the door, wait around, and maybe they'll let you in if you say the magic incantation just correctly. But go to reason.com/events for that, and also for a May 1st conversation between Dr. Nick Gillespie and Ben Smith of Sandefur about Ben Smith's new book about social media and Gawker and so forth. That's super awesome. Nick, anything else you want to briefly mention? Good. Go to reason.com podcasts for all of our offerings of the auditory variety, and reason.com/donate just to give us money because that's great. Thanks, and we'll catch you next week.